It was Thursday, the 2nd of March, 1876, in the parish of Shadwell, on the north bank of the River Thames in East London. Winter had not yet loosened its grip. Frost covered the cobblestones along Chapman Street, and the air smelled of coal smoke and the river at low tide. The street was narrow, lined with lodging houses that catered to dock workers, sailors on shore leave, and women who earned their living in ways that were not discussed openly. At number 14, Chapman Street, a house kept by a widow named Mrs. Elizabeth Marsh, a first-floor room was let to a young woman who had arrived 6 weeks earlier. Her name was given as Miss Harriet Shaw. She was 23 years old, slender, with dark hair worn in a simple knot. She kept to herself and paid her rent on time. She had told Mrs. Marsh that she worked as a seamstress and that she was from Norfolk, though she offered no further details. Mrs. Marsh had learned not to ask questions of her tenants. The room cost 4 shillings a week, paid in advance every Monday morning. Miss Shaw had been a quiet lodger, causing no trouble, receiving no visitors. On the morning of the 2nd of March, when Mrs. Marsh climbed the stairs and unlocked the door, she would discover that her tenant had been dead for some time. Harriet Shaw had arrived at number 14 Chapman Street on the 20th of January. She carried a small trunk and a carpet bag. She wore a dark wool coat and a bonnet that had seen better days. When Mrs. Marsh showed her the room, she examined it carefully, running her hand along the window-sill and checking the lock on the door. She paid the first week's rent from a purse that seemed otherwise empty. Mrs. Marsh asked no questions. The room was small. It contained a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a chair, and a table beneath the window. The wallpaper was stained with damp in the corners. A fireplace occupied one wall, though coal cost extra and most tenants did without it. Harriet said the room would be suitable. She was seen leaving the house most mornings at 8 o'clock. She returned in the evenings, sometimes carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. She purchased bread and milk from the shop on the corner, and tea from the grocer 2 streets away. She spoke to no one beyond what was necessary for these transactions. Mrs. Marsh observed that she seemed anxious, though about what, it was impossible to say. The other tenants rarely saw her. When they passed on the stairs, she lowered her eyes and hurried past. On the 28th of February, a man came to the house. He knocked at the street door and asked Mrs. Marsh if Miss Shaw was at home. He was well dressed, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a walking stick. Mrs. Marsh told him that Miss Shaw was out. The man asked when she might return. Mrs. Marsh said she did not know. The man thanked her and left. He did not give his name. Mrs. Marsh watched him walk away down Chapman Street and turn the corner toward the docks. She thought nothing more of it. The following day, the 29th of February, though 1876 was a leap year, and the date was in fact valid, Harriet Shaw did not leave her room. Mrs. Marsh noticed this only because she did not hear the usual footsteps on the stairs. By evening the house was silent. On the 1st of March, still no sound came from the first-floor room. Mrs. Marsh assumed the girl was unwell. It was not uncommon. She left her alone on the morning of the 2nd of March. Mrs. Marsh climbed the stairs with a bowl of broth. She had decided that if Miss Shaw was ill, a Christian duty required some small effort toward her comfort. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again and called the girl's name. Still, there was no response. She tried the handle. The door was locked from the inside. Mrs. Marsh returned downstairs and fetched the spare key from the drawer in the kitchen. When she opened the door, the first thing she noticed was the cold. The window was shut and the room was dim. The curtains had been drawn. Mrs. Marsh stepped inside and called out again. Her voice sounded strange in the stillness. She crossed to the bed. Harriet Shaw lay on her back, fully clothed, with her hands folded across her chest. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was pale and waxy. Mrs. Marsh touched her hand. It was cold as stone. She stepped back and stood for a moment, uncertain what to do. Then she turned and hurried down the stairs. She found a boy playing in the street and sent him running to fetch the police. Within the hour, Police Constable James Hodges arrived at number 14 Chapman Street. He examined the room carefully. The door had been locked from the inside. The window was fastened. There were no signs of a struggle. On the table beside the bed sat a teacup, empty except for a few dark drops at the bottom. A small brown bottle stood beside it. The label read tincture of laudanum. The bottle was nearly empty. Constable Hodges questioned Mrs. Marsh. She told him what little she knew. The girl had arrived 6 weeks earlier. She had given her name as Harriet Shaw. She had said she was a seamstress. She had paid her rent on time. She had kept to herself. A man had called for her 3 days before, but she had not been at home. Mrs. Marsh did not know his name. The constable made notes in his pocketbook. He instructed Mrs. Marsh not to touch anything in the room. He said that a doctor would need to examine the body and that the coroner would be informed. He locked the room and took the key with him. By noon, the news had spread along Chapman Street. Dr. Henry Whitmore, a physician who maintained a surgery on Ratcliffe Highway, arrived at the house shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He was escorted upstairs by Constable Hodges. The room had been left as it was found. Dr. Whitmore examined the body where it lay. He noted that rigor mortis had set in fully and that the skin had taken on a bluish tinge. He estimated that death had occurred at least 48 hours earlier, perhaps longer. He observed no external injuries, no bruising, no marks of violence. He lifted the teacup from the bedside table and examined it closely. A faint odor rose from the residue at the bottom. He turned his attention to the brown bottle. The label indicated that it had been dispensed by Chalmers and Son chemists of Whitechapel Road. The bottle had contained 4 fluid ounces of laudanum. Less than a quarter of an ounce remained. Dr. Whitmore made notes in a leather-bound journal that he carried with him. He stated that in his preliminary opinion, the deceased had died from an overdose of opium. Whether the overdose had been accidental or intentional, he could not yet say. He ordered that the body be removed to the mortuary for a full post-mortem examination. Inspector George Merritt from Thames Division was assigned to the case. He returned to Chapman Street the following morning and conducted a thorough search of the room. He found very little. The trunk contained 2 dresses, both plain and well worn, a shawl, stockings, a chemise, and a comb. There were no letters, no papers, no documents of any kind. The carpet bag was empty. In the pocket of the coat that hung on a peg behind the door, he found a handkerchief embroidered with the initials H.S. and a small purse containing 1 shilling and 3 pence. Nothing else. Inspector Merritt questioned the other tenants. None had spoken to Miss Shaw beyond brief greetings on the stairs. None knew where she worked or where she went during the day. None had seen the man who had called at the house on the 28th of February. Inspector Merritt visited the grocer and the baker. Both recognized Miss Shaw from his description, but neither could offer any information beyond the fact that she had purchased tea and bread on several occasions. She had always paid in coin and had never engaged in conversation. The post-mortem examination was conducted on the 4th of March at the Shadwell mortuary by Dr. Whitmore, assisted by Dr. James Lethbridge, the divisional surgeon. The body was that of a well-nourished female of approximately 23 years of age. There were no external injuries. The internal examination revealed congestion of the lungs and brain. The stomach was removed and its contents placed in a sealed jar for chemical analysis. Dr. Whitmore observed that the stomach lining showed signs consistent with opiate poisoning. Samples were forwarded to Professor Alfred Swain Taylor at Guy's Hospital, who was regarded as the foremost toxicologist in London. Professor Taylor conducted his analysis over the course of 3 days. He applied reagents to the stomach contents and observed the characteristic crystalline formations that indicated the presence of morphine. He estimated that the deceased had ingested between 3 and 4 grains of morphine, a dose sufficient to cause death in a person unaccustomed to the drug. In his written report, dated the 9th of March, he stated that death had been caused by acute opium poisoning. He noted that the quantity ingested suggested either a deliberate act of self-destruction or a fatal miscalculation in dosage. Inspector Merritt visited the chemist shop of Chalmers and Son on Whitechapel Road. He spoke with Mr. Edward Chalmers, the proprietor. Mr. Chalmers consulted his poison register, a ledger in which all sales of dangerous substances were required by law to be recorded. He found an entry dated the 27th of February. A 4-ounce bottle of tincture of laudanum had been sold to a young woman who had given her name as Harriet Shaw and her address as Chapman Street, Shadwell. She had signed the register in a neat, careful hand. The signature matched the handwriting on a receipt found tucked inside one of the dresses in the trunk. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. When Becondiff the 7th of March, Inspector Merritt received information from a constable in Norfolk. A family named Shaw, residing near the village of Holt, had reported that their daughter Harriet had left home in December of the previous year, following a disagreement. She had told them she was going to London to find work. They had received one letter from her in January, postmarked Shadwell. Since then, they had heard nothing. When informed of the death, they travelled to London and identified the body as that of their daughter. They stated that she had been of good character but had been deeply unhappy in recent months. Dr. Whitmore taught as they the Flourished slowly. The jury consisted of 12 men drawn from the parish. Mrs. Elizabeth Marsh gave evidence first. She described how she had found the body and stated that Miss Shaw had seemed anxious and withdrawn during her time at the lodging house. Dr. Whitmore testified regarding the post-mortem findings. He stated that death had been caused by opium poisoning and that the quantity ingested had been lethal. Professor Taylor's written report was read into the record. He confirmed that morphine had been detected in the stomach contents in a concentration consistent with a fatal dose. Mr. Edward Chalmers testified that he had sold the laudanum to the deceased on the 27th of February. She had appeared calm and had stated that she required it for toothache. He had seen no reason to refuse the sale. She had signed the poison register as required by law. Inspector Merritt gave evidence regarding the investigation. He stated that no note had been found in the room and that the deceased's family had confirmed she had been distressed before leaving home. He described the visit of the unknown man on the 28th of February. Despite inquiries, the man had not been identified. The coroner addressed the jury. He stated that they must determine how the deceased had come to her death. The evidence showed that she had died from opium poisoning. The question was whether the dose had been taken deliberately or by accident. There was no note. There was no witness to the act itself. However, the quantity of laudanum consumed far exceeded any reasonable medicinal dose. The jury retired to consider their verdict. After 30 minutes, they returned. The foreman announced that they had reached a unanimous decision. The verdict was recorded as follows: that Harriet Shaw had died on or about the 1st of March 1876 from the effects of opium poisoning, self-administered whilst in a state of temporary insanity. The coroner thanked the jury for their service. The inquest was concluded. The body was released to the family for burial. No further investigation was conducted. The file was closed. The room at number 14 Chapman Street was let to a new tenant within the week. The death of Harriet Shaw was reported in the East London Observer on the 18th of March. The article occupied 4 column inches on page 3. It stated that a young woman from Norfolk had been found dead in a Shadwell lodging house, having taken her own life by means of laudanum. No further details were provided. The article appeared between a notice of a shipping arrival and an advertisement for boot polish. It was not mentioned again. Harriet was buried in the churchyard of All Saints, Holt, on the 23rd of March. Her parents and 2 younger sisters attended. The vicar read the service. Rain fell throughout. The grave was marked with a simple stone that bore her name and the years of her birth and death. No inscription was added. Within a year, her name was spoken only rarely in the village, and then in lowered voices. The circumstances of her death were not discussed openly. In London, life continued as it always had. Mrs. Marsh let the room to a sailor who paid 2 weeks in advance. The teacup was washed and placed back on the shelf. The brown bottle was thrown into the dustbin. The signature in the poison register at Chalmers and Son remained in the ledger, but the page was turned and forgotten. Inspector Merritt moved on to other cases. There were always other cases. The identity of the man who had called at Chapman Street on the 28th of February was never established. Some speculated that he had been a suitor who had caused Harriet distress. Others suggested he had been a relative, or perhaps an employer. The truth was never known. In the absence of evidence, speculation faded. The question remained unanswered. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had required chemists to keep records of all sales of poisons, including laudanum. The law had been intended to prevent accidental deaths and to provide a means of tracing those who purchased dangerous substances. In practice, it was easily circumvented. False names could be given, signatures could be forged. The registers were rarely inspected. Harriet Shaw had signed her real name and given her true address, and it had made no difference. The poison had been sold, the death had occurred, the system had failed to protect her. By the turn of the century, Chapman Street had been demolished to make way for warehouses. The lodging house at number 14 was gone. The people who had lived there were scattered or dead. The memory of Harriet Shaw, if it existed at all, existed only in the pages of the coroner's record, bound and filed in a basement archive where no one looked anymore. In the silence of that archive, among the dust and the forgotten names, the file remains.